Alright, good evening and hello to all Ryu's, Ken's, Laura's, and Chun-Li players across the globe. Everyone else is also included, of course, but those are the four I chose randomly to talk to today. This content is being restreamed from Amara2_MK to our main 2_MK channel with full permission. And today we'll be looking at how to identify the type of player your opponent is with some reliable little techniques you can use in the lower tiers specifically. This technique does work going into the upper, but as players gain more specific skills, it stops being relevant overall. So this should be a lesson that is taken in a very specific way from people who are trying to get up in ranks and feel themselves lost when moving from one opponent to another. We are testing our new HyperX headset, so there may be some changes in the way that the sound is coming through on the stream today, and there will also probably be some adjustments as I shift the mic around to find the optimal spacing for it. We're still doing basic tests. Obviously I could simply speak less loudly as I've been before. This video will be edited for content for our YouTube advice channel, and we will definitely be seeing some very specific points in the video where things will drop to silence, mostly for such reasons. For those of you who are not familiar with the general way that Street Fighter players and gamers in general play particular characters, this is not about characters. This is not here to help you learn character matchups per se. You're going to have to apply a lot of your own skill and understanding to change what is told here into something you can use for a matchup, especially because there are a lot of things in matchups that any given player does that you can't really predict outright. These are just some basic guidelines to try to understand players quickly so that you can adapt your own plans, or to understand yourself so that you can see where you should try to adapt your plans when your opponent seems to have downloaded you or otherwise able to cause you problems in general. While this is going on, we will be working with the Dalsim bot. Dalsim bot is not really new to the members of the 2_MK team. He's been available to us for a while, but given that Dalsim was supposed to get some buffs in the patch, we weren't really sure whether or not we were going to keep the bot the same way. This is in fact part of what is being tested today while I talk about it. So we're going to engage Dalsim bot, but at certain times we're going to change what actions Dalsim bot is doing in order to illustrate the point. But for now, Dalsim bot is activated, and battles with him will start with him in the corner for various reasons. I won't go into too much detail as to what Dalsim bot specifically is doing outside of the lesson, but I will change over at a KO point, and we'll start to talk in earnest about content itself. For those of you who are not aware of Dalsim bot's goals, just in case you are the sort of person who quickly pushes in bots when you see them on stream and you want to understand what you're aiming to do here, it's fairly simple. You're aiming to do that when it goes into the air with a jump and floats there. With his air B skill, you are aiming to air him. You want to dash in and throw him when he does his trigger, preferably if he does it off a combo, which he doesn't generally do. You want to be able to V-reversal the V-trigger that he uses, and you want to be able to walk up to him in certain situations. It's fairly hard to do because of all of the normals coming at you, but if you just treat him as a regular character, it's not too hard. There are some other minor things get your points against him, but for the most part you should consider it to be air-to-airs and anti-airs of very specific situations, so that you know how to do your wake-ups, you know how to deal with Dalsim pressure. It's not going to be able to teach you how to fight Dalsim himself very much. High-level Dalsim players, or even people who try to play Dalsim normally, will all focus on slightly different things about the character, and it is that technical trickiness that makes him a good choice for showing off some of the things required for this. So what we're going to talk about first is the type of player that applies pressure. This is, in the lower ranks, the most common type of player, unless of course the player is playing Ryu. You can assume that for the most part, players are aiming to apply pressure, especially if they think they're good at the game, or just feel really comfortable in the game itself. Pressure is a matter of hitting buttons that are safe, chaining them into other buttons that are safe, and at some point in the middle of that, repositioning self to start over before your opponent can react. It does not necessarily mean that you are moving in on the opponent. A pressure player can in fact be defensive, in that they wait for the player to come to them, react to what the player has done, and then apply pressure directly after that. This is fairly easy to do, and it's something that comes up fairly often because when you are applying pressure and you fail and get knocked down, you want to be able to knock your opponent off you and restart your own pressure. So they tend to have a lot of experience with that style of play. This doesn't mean that because they throw fireballs that they're not pressure. It doesn't mean that if they move toward or away from you in any particular way it's pressure. You're looking for certain signs of a pressure play. So in this case, I'm going to ask Amara to change the things available to Dalsim to just actions 3 and 4. We're turning off actions 1, 2, and 5. And while this combination of actions is not fully useful overall, it will show some parts of what the pressure style Dalsim does. Particularly this sequence in 4. You can jump out of this, and there are ways you can punish Dalsim's limbs, but if you're not really prepared for it, he's able to keep this sort of thing up for quite some time. Know that he doesn't necessarily care if he's near to you or not. He just does it because he's expecting you to keep blocking, and if you do keep blocking, then he'll be able to push you off. This is the sort of player that you can identify through about 3 things in this order. The first thing you can usually identify about them is that they do not use, generally do not use sweep, or do not use buttons that have a high reward but also a high risk. They tend to hit lights, mediums that they know are safe, buttons they know are safe-ish from longer ranges if they're really good. But their aim is to do this because they expect you to block. This is the most important way to identify a pressure player. They don't actually expect to open you up except when they are repositioning. Their buttons are not there generally for you to get hit by them. For those of you familiar with the concept of frame traps, they may have good strings purely for frame traps, but at lower tiers, they're not generally frame trapping as yet. It's the skill that they have to pick up later. The second thing to understand about a pressure player is that they often know where their block strings will put them relative to you. And they use this information to keep you in a particular space just long enough for them to reposition safely. They're relying on the fact that the reaction you need to use themselves in order to stop them from doing that is somehow difficult. This is often because many characters don't have anti-air buttons that are easy to time when you're crossing the opponent, when you're being crossed up by the opponent. So you may see something common such as a Nash player of this type would use 2 crouching medium punches and then jump to get a jumping medium kick cross up almost immediately. It is difficult to anti-air this, but we're all told we need to learn our anti-airs. So they're exploiting the fact that you feel as if you need to anti-air. There's not much chance of you trying to hit a button after the crouching medium punch, because they might do something random and then hit you and make it worse. So they reposition themselves in that break. And they don't have much fear when it comes to being hit. It's a part of their required style that if they are pressuring and you manage to knock them out of their pressure, they should be prepared to go right back to that pressure. And they will have a tendency, unless one of their moves is really required for sustaining pressure in the EX version, they will tend to not only save their meter for wake ups, they also have a higher tendency to use their meter on wake ups. This sort of player, finally, also often knows some really good meaties off of whatever is their most common knockdown, because they're not necessarily expecting you to be caught in the meaty, but if they know a really good one that leaves them in that same sort of safe situation, they have no real reason other than an invincible reversal on your part not to rush up and do it. They also play in a style that makes a lot of players very frustrated and willing to spend meter to just do damage, spend meter on super, spend meter on other things. Or they attack really early into the round and get as much damage as they can before that, so that they only have to worry about this happening once or twice, get some form of meter advantage, and then the opponent, having felt pressured themselves to get some damage, dashes in on them, tries their own meaties, and so on, often getting knocked back by whatever invincible reversal is available. You can tell pressure style characters because they have this option a lot of the time. Ken is like this, Ibuki is like this, Cammy is like this, Nikali to some extent is also like this. This is not to say that anyone playing those characters is necessarily in the pressure style of play, or even that you should expect pressure players, as I noted before, to always be trying to get in on you. The idea is that once they are close to you, they're going to hit a lot of quick, safe buttons and try to keep you from responding to them until they get to a position where they can do something that is hard to respond to. That's their entire goal. Do lots of things that are hard to respond to. So now I'm going to ask Amara to change Dalsim's actions again, this time to turn on actions 5 and 1 only, and restart the battle in order to demonstrate the next form that you will often see. The next style of player that you're used to seeing is the zoner. Now, being able to play by throwing fireballs is not the only thing that makes a zoning player that type of player. A zoner player has a specific goal in mind, and it is part of the name. The zoning player is attempting to keep you in a particular zone of the screen at any given time, so that they can retain control of that zone. Note that a character can do this even without a fireball at all if they have the right sequence of moves. You can see with Dalsim, for example, that while he does have that Yoga Fire as a way of controlling space, it controls a very specific space which it didn't really control before. But he does have other tools for controlling the space in front of him and controlling the space what happens when you try to jump preemptively. Zoning players, however, have a different mindset toward the game altogether than pressure players in general, since their aim is to keep you in a particular space. They use techniques that often help them with this. Going into the air, such as you're seeing Dalton do now, while it is not really helping him, it's more so in this bot that is meant to be the weakness that you need to exploit. It is still not a terrible plan, especially against characters who have a lot of trouble getting close to Dalton in the first place in order to do any of this. If Amara's Ryu was further away from Dalton in general and had to start from there and then try to get near to him, you can see that this actually becomes a little bit more complicated because he moves away from you, he moves around. That's part of the Dalton bot goal, to make you able to react to the fact that he does this. A zoner might simply jump and hit their neutral jump heavy kick. They might jump forward and hit their heavy kick. Or whatever button gives them the longest ranged attack that they can land on you from the air. This is another way of becoming difficult to anti-air, but unlike the pressure character who is attempting to keep a space where they can continue to pressure you, the zoner is of course trying to keep a space that allows them to zone you more. They want to keep the maximum distance from you fairly often. And when they are close to you, a lot of what they do is based on the idea that they can knock you down easily. This causes zoners to have some strange tendencies which you can use to identify them. The first is that they're very likely to use large moves in neutral. In contrast to the pressure player, they will throw out their heavy punches, even if the heavy punch is not likely to be that safe, or at least would stop it from being their turn. But they're going to do this for maximum range. They'll also throw out things like their heavy kick as long as it's enough to make you stay in a particular space because you're worried about it. They may or may not be good at anti-airs, but because anti-airs are a very reactionary thing, and the zoner may have been thinking about how to keep you in a particular space rather than how to react to something you do that they did not set up, their anti-airs won't necessarily be the best. They're more likely to try to just stay out of the range where you can jump at them at all. But they will jump at you with very specific ranges that are just outside where you would get a lot of damage from jumping. They're willing to give up that damage that they would get from jumping from closer just to make it impossible to counter jump that. And you'll see a lot of heavy kicks from Ryu's in particular, because this is a very good button for Ryu to jump forward with because it hits so deep. But Ryu doesn't usually get really good combos off that heavy kick. But the zoner isn't looking for very good combos. They're looking for a way to hit you with the most basic combos possible, usually just heavy kick into sweep. That is another way to identify them. They are more likely to use sweeps than other players. But there's a specific reason for this as well. Zoners are very good at getting into position to throw you. They do approach you, and they do like to throw. The reason that they throw is often because many zoning characters have throws that put the opponent far from them. And those that do not, it's an easy thing to hit. It doesn't require a lot of execution. It doesn't require a lot of time spent understanding a situation to try to manipulate it. So they throw. And once they've thrown you, they can restart their zoning pressure. If you do get close to them, or if they end up close to you, especially on wake up, if they've managed to somehow get a knockdown, collide in the air or whatever, you'll often see them sweep or use a crouching medium kick or some other low on people on wake up, and this is because zoners have a tendency to bait the opponent's actions on wake up because they don't particularly want to try to get damage through pressure. They don't want you to block. They want to be able to get away from you. But that puts them in a strange situation. If they try to walk or jump away from someone who they're standing next to, there's a chance that person is going to hit buttons and cause them a problem. However, if their timing is good and they hit the button first, especially such thing as a crouching medium kick, the opponent was robbed of the ability to walk away from them, but if their timing was good, there was no chance of the opponent hitting them. So you will see things like crouching medium kick on your wake up. You may see things like crouching medium kick on their wake up, depending on what they think you're going to do. Or they'll just bait you if they don't think that your character has a lot of good options for waking up other than hitting their invincible reversal or some other similar thing. And this allows you to identify them because you have spent a lot of time blocking low and guarding your legs until they have chosen to move away from you, or until you have found a way to hit them for doing it. Zoning characters and characters who are generally strong in this style often have crouching medium kicks that are only -2 or even -1, +1 in Korean case. The characters that don't, such as Guile, often have some other method that they can use altogether, such as the safe sonic boom. Guile can actually hit you with sonic booms on your wake up depending on his timing, and be safe to jump away from you. But you can generally identify zoners by those things. They will neutral jump in neutral, because it helps give them control, and they will respond to you jumping forward with probably their aerial heavy kick. They stand further away, and when they jump at you, it is normally with the longest button they can manage, so that you would not have thought to jump at them before that point. And they attack your legs on your wake up as pressure, or just when they end up too close to you, as a way of getting you to either get hit or try to move away from them. And if you block, especially if they use the crouching medium kick instead of sweeping, they'll often take the chance to backdash or jump backwards themselves, or maybe even neutral jump. The Dowson bot, in this case, would probably be a little better at this form of zoning if we turned on action 4 as well, so I'm going to ask Amara to do that. When that action is added, he becomes a lot more pokey about where he wants you to be. So this is just the basic demonstration using one of our bots to understand what you can focus on about the opponent to identify them. But now we're going to move on to the third type of opponent. Now Dowson bot doesn't really identify this very well, but we do have some ways. If he's left with actions 1, 2, and 3 on, and with 4 and 5 off, we'll get to see something that approximates to what I'm about to explain. Now, the pressure character should not necessarily be confused with the close-in player. The close-in player, their idea of how to play the game is from right next to you. What exactly they want to do depends a lot on their character. You'll find that many Raptors have this as their strongest style, and obviously therefore many people who like this style play Raptors. The idea of the player whose aim is to close in is that once they feel that they are close enough to you, they have more options, and they often feel as if you have less options. This can be a complete illusion, but that won't stop them. In the lower tiers, if they don't have a different method, another really good dash or something, these players are very likely to jump a lot. But unlike a pressure player who is jumping after a sequence, the close-in player just jumps most of the time. Because they're relying on a situation where they have managed to get you into a throw. That throw has created a situation they're comfortable with without having to do a lot of combo execution that they could drop. And they will hopefully play a character whose throws leave them close, and they can just attempt another throw or try to bait you into something. But once they're far away from you, you should definitely expect dashes and often jumps. If they have a move that moves them across the screen but isn't too unsafe, you will see a lot of that, some repetition. In Dalsim's case, as I said, he's not the best character for it, but this sequence does help a bit. He can teleport onto you, he can teleport over your head and approach that way. And he has a slide in here that he uses to cross parts of the screen without being too concerned about whether or not the slide is actually going to hit you. In fact, close-in players are quite capable of using that, and we'll get to that in a moment. So to identify them, the main things you're looking for is that once you have knocked them away from you, they may throw a few fireballs if they have a character like that, but give them long enough, give them about 3 seconds, and the close-in player tends to move toward you in some way, and they try to move toward you very quickly, in some way that they expect to not be too reactable, not be too susceptible to zoning, not be too susceptible to getting caught in their motion. And once they're in, if they're good at combos, because they're usually higher level, the higher level ones will know some combos to hit you with. The lower level ones will often use moves that are hard to anti-air while jumping from close. This is what separates them from the zoners, in that they are not going to jump as much with the long range move, because if you block those, they're not close anymore. They don't get to get the benefit of the jumping. You'll see a lot more jumping with light kick, and you may see some attempted cross-ups, but this is usually more of a last resort tactic that they use after tricking you into thinking they're going to do a particular thing, because unlike the pressure player, they're not so used to exactly the spacing for their cross-ups. Their goal is to be close, and this is how they solve problems. If you can consistently defeat them from close, they may slow down, but it's not as if they'll normally switch to another strategy until you get to the higher tiers of Street Fighter. They'll just stop for a while, maybe do some random moves to make you think that they are changing strategy, and then when you react, then they'll move forward again. Now, I mentioned characters who have other ways of doing this. Characters with slide attacks, particularly and Bison and Vega, these characters have attacks that become safer the further away they've done them from. And this can be an extremely confusing thing to some new players, because you learn a lot about frame data. They tell you, well, Bison's slide is like -12 or worse. You have plenty of time to punish this move. That's not necessarily true if Bison was standing so far away from you when you did the slide that only one of the last active frames of the slide actually connected with your block. And this allows the player to get in close, while at the same time causing you to try to punish them in a way that won't actually work. Close-in players are very fond of characters like this, where you are likely to try a move that is not necessarily that unsafe, but something about it has changed the properties. You have tried let's say a 7-frame move, when they have manipulated their movement so that they aren't -7. Your 7-frame move is then negative as well, and then you get thrown. You have to be ready to throw tech a lot against close-in characters. But this is not enough, because once they've realized you're doing that, then they can just take advantage of the fact that they expect you to throw and play as if they are pressure characters, at least enough to throw out like one of their closest range normals and maybe get in a combo. The weakness of the close-in player doesn't really need to be taught. Depending on their skills with particular characters, they can get far, but the way to defeat them isn't usually too complicated. Give them some time and they will quote-unquote hang themselves. This is the sort of player that you often hear about. Doesn't stop jumping, doesn't stop dashing, doesn't stop sliding. But it isn't necessarily true that you can keep quiet and wait for this sort of player to just destroy themselves. Because you're really just giving them time to practice where to jump from, what to try to hit you with, and those other things. And if they have a lot of experience with your character, they will manipulate that situation to slowly whittle you down at least. Even if your defense is good in terms of throw techs and so on. Quite a lot of characters in this game can be considered grapplers, and this allows the player to use this tactic. It's not necessarily like a pressure player, because a pressure player, even though they will use throws, definitely, the pressure player expects you to block or hit something. Hit something quick. The close-in player isn't paying attention to any of that. As far as they're concerned, they're setting up a situation where you think you can punish them, but can't, and they get to punish you. Even if it's just hitting throw and not doing anything too complicated. And the reason this works for them is because a lot of people, once they've messed up a punish, don't hit even more buttons, because they're used to playing against pressure people who will take advantage of that. If the game was made up of only close-in players and pressure players, you've got no advantage, because you don't know which one you're fighting, and they can look the same. You have to watch for what their skills are in and how often they throw you, and so on. Or more accurately, how often they attempt to throw you. Now there are two types of player remaining, but only one of them needs to specifically be talked about, because the fifth is a little more complicated in terms of how they use their character. And you can use the other knowledge against them without too much effort. The final type of player is the frustration type player. A frustration player is generally aiming to fool you into thinking that they are one of the other types, and then break your expectations in order to damage you. Now, this obviously would seem like the best strategy, but the frustration player is more of a jack of all trades in that they must learn at least enough about the other two or three ways to play their character to be a successful mimic and not just mess up stuff, drop combos, get defeated. Or they're playing a frustration style character who has a lot of good confusing normals or even confusing specials, and they're pressing you with these moves because they are aware that for whatever reason you can't stop it. They will seem to do very random moves quite a lot of the time, because that is also a very strong psychological method of frustrating people. Some players will just do Shoryuken randomly without even combos or neutral or anything, just because they think you're not expecting them to be doing that, and when they succeed, it's frustrating. And then you'll get caught up in, okay, I'm just gonna stop and wait for you to Shoryuken because this is stupid. And then they don't, they walk up and throw you or something. They're aiming to break your expectation. So for Dalsimbot, just to give a little demonstration of that if we can, we're going to turn off his action 1 and turn on options 2, 3, and 4. 5 is somewhat useful for this, but not very. This combination of actions makes Dalsim come as close as possible to a frustration player. Because these actions can look very similar and they tend to move into one another. They are also based around causing a reaction, a supposedly correct reaction, and then one of Dalsim's options being to either continue that thing until he has made you annoyed, which is when they are imitating pressure basically, or to immediately react in some way that they basically pre-planned, and they're taking the chance that you're going to react yourself and they'll hit you. So in order to understand a frustration player's offensive abilities, you don't really have to learn anything. You just learn what the other 3 types do. And until they randomly shift on you, just fight as if they're one of those. Or if they're the type of player who uses a character who can just innately be frustrating, wait on them. Wait on them more the same sort of way that you wait on a closing in player. Because eventually they will do something that doesn't make any sense. The reason they do something that doesn't make any sense is different though. They are doing moves to make you want to respond, and then they're doing the move that beats the main normal response. The close-in player is usually just trying to throw you or do anything that stops you from keeping them out so that they can keep putting pressure on you. But for defeating a frustration player, you actually have a different option. Because the frustration player has to spend so much time focused on how to make you most annoyed, their defenses against sudden moves of your own is actually usually less. There are people who are relatively easy to jump in on because unlike the pressure player, who is specifically learning and aiming how to put themselves at the right position to keep up pressure, the frustration player hasn't necessarily mastered this as far until you get into the higher ranks. They hit buttons mostly to make you hit buttons in response, and then eventually they will mess themselves up. But one of the few things that you won't see from them normally is good anti-airs. It doesn't work if you jump on them all the time, obviously, because then their frustration instinct kicks in. They go, oh, you must be a person who likes to jump. I'm going to frustrate you out of your jumping. But if you do it occasionally, especially in neutral, the mindset that they would be in by that point is that they are now trying to think of what button can I hit now that will be the most frustrating thing for them to face. And while they're thinking about that, or just before they actually press the button, you can jump. Because now they have to change their mentality back to anti-air. They can't preemptively hit the anti-air button because then they've shown their hand, they've basically made it clear that they're expecting this from you. And they hate doing that. They like to keep you feeling as if you are failing all the time by seemingly always predicting your next move. But they don't do it by controlling the space very well. And they don't do it by making sure that they have pushed you into doing this particular move as your only option. They try these things, and until they've shown otherwise, you can generally assume that they will be like either the zoner or the pressure player. And you can treat them as such until you realize, hey, wait, this is a zoner, but I'm actually getting frustrated because they're not doing zoning things consistently. Now obviously, again, as you go into the higher ranks, a person can add other things to their style, evolve and so on. But do remember that everyone takes a certain amount of time in this game to get up to higher ranks. And by the nature of the rank match system, If they were particularly good at doing many things, they would probably be higher ranked. So it's a relatively safe assumption that until you have gotten out of base silver, you are probably going to be facing these 4 types of players. The final type of player we will cover in a video tomorrow, but the short explanation of them is that they are only aiming to either play mix-ups or play to the strengths of their character, while not particularly aiming for any of the other types. The way that you can tell what type they are, or how you should treat them, is to simply learn about the character they've chosen. Figure out the strongest potential incarnation of that character. Is that character better at zoning? Is that character better at closing in? Is that character better at frustrating? And just play them as if they're that type. They may still do some things that frustrate you, or a few unexpected things. Or if they're a character specialist, which they often are, you may get one of the most difficult matches you've ever had. But that is a way for you to go into matchups themselves and how to learn matchups, because those people have learned their characters and you can end up learning matchups from them. However, once again, this type of player doesn't tend to be in the lower tiers often because they're usually more comfortable with either their character or the game. And even if it's a large struggle and they play for long periods, they pick up a bunch of little extra tricks and tend to rank up higher. So if you encounter them on the way through, they'll usually have this long win streak because they've ground out something in casuals or whatever, and they're just trying to get up through the ranks as fast as they can, and you can defeat them with whatever. Now, if you have identified what type of player you are, you probably also have an idea of what to look out for when you're overdoing it, and what your opponents will be looking for from you. Whether or not you change these habits or try to change the player type that you are is up to you, but we will definitely be talking later on in the week about choosing the right character for you, and characters that aren't necessarily perfectly suited but can do certain styles well, and characters that you will struggle playing particular styles with. So that's the end of the main explanation segment, and therefore I'm going to have Amara turn on both the network fight request settings, turn on some ranked matches, and also to return Dalsimbot to his full state with all his inputs on, just to give something to do and focus on between rounds. So today we're going to be continuing now with some examples. With any luck, we will meet at least one of each type of opponent. And as mentioned before, the video will probably be edited for this purpose, just to show off particular types. But it's entirely possible that it will be a myriad of zoners, a bunch of pressure players, and so on. Now obviously this is not a 100% way of identifying opponents, but it's obviously better than nothing. Oh, that was quick. And it's also useful in just letting you ground yourself so that you can spend time learning things about your own character or other characters, rather than having to deal with particular things all the time and thinking that you don't know what you're doing because there's just too much to keep track of. This helps you distill down a bit so that you can say, I'm going to approach this way. It might not be that it's the absolute best way to approach it, but being able to say from the beginning, I intend to approach this way, allows you to look back at the matches with a different mindset when you review them later. Especially if you do fairly well but not super well. You can see where in the match you could have done better based on the fact that you were trying to do a particular thing. And not just reacting or trying to figure out a character or trying to figure out a player. So far for the day, we have done some of this before. So far for the day, we've been running into a lot of Ryu. But this is useful because Ryu is a character that actually can be played in all those styles. He technically even has a style that is based primarily on playing Ryu, quote-unquote, as Ryu, which is a lot of meter management and careful attention to defense. It often looks like a defensive pressure style, but it can also look like something else. But again, those are generally going to be people who have mastered some form of Ryu that is not the standard Ryu player. So, if we get another string of Ryu, it definitely won't be disappointing. Similarly, if we get a string of Ed, it's probably not going to be a problem. Ed being one of the other characters who can be fairly easily played in this way. Now, the most important thing to understand is that you cannot make any assumptions about the player based on their character. You can make a bias, you can watch out for a particular opening gambit, and you can tilt your concept of who you're up against based on those two things together. You have to watch the first thing they do in the match, and then you can use that for a guess, but it's still just a guess. So if this Ed, for example, jumps, I'm going to assume they're close in. If they dash and then do a move, I'm going to assume they're pressure. If they backdash, I'm going to assume they're a zoner. And if they do a neutral jump, I'm also going to assume that they're a zoner. So we see the slight backward movement and the very far away jump that isn't really supposed to cross you up or get in on your end. So my assumption is that, hey, this is a zoning guy. They're doing moves from outside of the range where they are sure the moves will hit. They are throwing some fireballs, and they're jumping from really far out. They're also defensive when they are not in a good situation, waiting for you to either try to attack them or give them an opportunity to get back out. And you'll note again that they're hitting really heavy buttons in neutral. They're not going into like jab block strings. We're seeing some of that now, but it's still not really optimized at all. So from that round alone, we can basically assume that Amara needs to deal with this player in a very specific way. Wait for them to do certain things when they jump in, but overall, they're going to be trying to make sure that she can't walk away or that they get to, so she can clip there. She has to watch her feet so that she doesn't get clipped by their moves. And she can just block their jump-ins because they're never going to cross up. They're not going to hit moves that really matter in that spacing. And they're probably not going to throw. I mean, zoners do throw after a while. But if you are able to keep the match moving back and forth, they don't really change into that mode of, oh, I am continuing to jump and being blocked, I should start going. Now, one thing you can do to help you against zoners is actually to not try to hit them when they're in neutral like this, and furthermore, to not specifically try to throw them. Both of those things put those ideas in their heads, and it can remind a zoner who is not thinking about those things that they should also be doing those things, making it harder on you. Overall, since they don't tend to do a lot of damage if you just block their jump-ins, if you have a good way to get away from them, you just shouldn't anti-air them at all. If you don't have a way to get away from them, you should try to position yourself to make anti-airing easier. Now, this is not necessarily something Amara needs to do. Amara is also generally a zoner, and she can therefore afford to throw the opposing zoners. She can also afford to use particular attack styles that involve meeting in the air or this sort of thing. If you just watch the flow between the two of them, they both tend to do very similar things. Jump from far ranges, hit buttons that are safe-ish but don't necessarily do too much, throw each other around. Note that, and this is super important, this is two zoners fighting but no one throws any fireballs. Why? Because neither of them wants the fireball game to start in the first place. You start fireball games in zoner versus zoner matches by getting some form of meter advantage and then making it a good idea for you to do it and not a good idea for them to do it. You just win out that way. But here they are both at full bar. This is also a thing that happens often, and you have to be very careful of it. It's relatively advanced compared to what I was saying before, but it's worth mentioning now. Zoners tend to save their meter for smooth. Their fighting style lends itself to this. They don't need meter for many things, and they spend a lot of time making actions that get blocked, making actions that are not easily responded to, resulting in a lot of situations where they have full bar and nothing in particular to do with it. This sort of match can be fairly slow, but I assure you that to them, there is a bunch of stuff going on. There's a lot of thinking involved here, because they are watching ranges and tendencies and flows. For example, a zoner player will nearly never walk backward like Ed has just done, and then jump again, because they know that they have placed themselves outside of the range of a good jump in, because they were not at the range for the good jump in when they started walking backward. That's where they want to stand in the first place, so that they have the highest chance of responding to you throwing your own fireball or using some anti-fireball move, even if they're not throwing any fireballs.
Round one. Fight!
So you will see a lot of dancing around, and when that dancing around happens, it is a small opportunity for a zoner to throw their own fireball at the opponent. But since they're walking backward, if you do it too early, they'll just block it. So they learn the timing at which their opponent stops walking backward. This is actually super important in a zoner versus zoner match. So if you are a zoner yourself, this is one of the key things you can pay attention to. How long does your opponent spend walking backward before they walk forward again? And just throw your own fireball at exactly that moment. But there's all sorts of meta involved. So if they realize that's what you're doing, depending on the range, they'll start jumping again. Many layers come into this, but the key is that even though the match can look as if, oh, this is just stuff happening, people are just doing things because they're at the right ranges, that's not how it starts. And if you're good at the game, you realize the adaptations that are happening as adaptations and not necessarily as, oh, I can't tell if they're going to jump or if they're going to stay on the ground, I have no idea, this is just annoying me. No, there is a pattern to this. It's just a pattern that can change within the space of 3 rounds, as with any game that allows adaptations. So Amara can be fairly confident that when they come in close, she can do that. But if she gets too close, they will use crouching medium kick and therefore stop her from walking away. So against another zoner, your defense option is usually not, oh, I'll walk backward, unless you're trying to make space yourself. Your defensive option is, okay, they're a little far out, they can't throw me, I'll just crouch block. And note that again, he doesn't go for the throw, even though for many people that would be the obvious option. And again, you'll note that whereas against a pressure character right then, Amara might have just woken up with Hadouken. Shinku Hadouken. But why not? Because the zoner is not there to, not that close to you to do that. They're there to make you do that and then hurt you more.
Final round.
So she brought that round back, and we're still in close proximity, seeing a lot of motion without a lot of necessarily attacking going on. But now you're at the meta level. You're at the level where Amara can go, well, I know you're going to try to clip my legs, I know you're going to take a little longer to do it than most players. I can do things like Tatsu in that spaces. Because they're not expecting that, they're not ready for that. They're thinking, how can I clip your legs? How can I hit you with my fireball? How can I do zony type moves?